All right. Hello. Welcome to episode 7 of the Current Review. And this is the first episode where we have a guest. And our guest is Levi Tillemann. And he has so much history in the automotive industry and public policy and so much. First off, he's the author of The Great Race. Unfortunately, I don't have my copy with me right here in my apartment, but it's an incredible book discussing the EV industry and you wrote this like in 2015, correct? So
We published it in 2015. So I've been writing for a couple of years before that.
Okay, excellent. And I think just from where this book was written, it really sets the stage of where the EV industry is today. And besides your book, you've also been present on lots of other things in the industry, including the Circular Car Initiative at the World Economic Forum, and you were part of the Obama administration. So there's so much history here to talk about. But I guess before we get to this, could you kind of talk about how when you were writing The Great Race, how you got into EVs and what inspires you about them?
Yeah, sure. So, I think I had a little bit of an unconventional path into the EV space. I've always been a huge environmentalist, and that started out really simple. When I was a kid, I loved going outside. I loved catching frogs and snakes and lizards and whatever else I could get my hands on. I considered myself kind of an amateur naturalist. And probably if I had my druthers, that's what I would have done for the rest of my life, right? I would have been in the Amazon collecting samples or something like that. I remember my favorite author was a guy named Gerald Durrell, who wrote these incredible books about both his adventures as an amateur naturalist, and when he got older, he established a network of zoos that were dedicated to captive breeding of endangered species. And so he would go out and he'd collect all of these different species, and then he would breed them and he would return the offspring to the wild. And I just loved those stories. I loved the environment. And at a certain point, I started to ask myself, what is the best way that I can preserve ecosystems? What's the best way that I can make some sort of an impact in sustaining these natural treasures? And I realized that clean energy was probably the way to go. So that's probably the deepest background. I started, though, not in the EV space. I started with more efficient internal combustion engines. And you guys might be a little bit young to remember this, but in the early 2000s, there was a lot of enthusiasm around biofuels and the idea that what were called fourth generation biofuels would allow us to take industrial waste and turn it into something very similar to gasoline. And so I, together with some co-founders, and I'm happy to get a little bit deeper into that history if you're interested, we developed a more efficient internal combustion engine called the Internally Radiating Impulse Structure Engine, or IRIS engine. And I spent a number of years working on that. One of the co-founders was my dad, was an inventor, and he used to come up with interesting ideas and start new companies when I was a kid. And this was sort of his last big idea. And unfortunately, he got into a car accident while we were working on this project together. And so at a very young age, I became CEO of Iris Engines. And as I was looking at all of the different options for clean mobility, I was kind of struck by battery electric vehicles for a number of reasons. But the most significant one was that the California Air Resources Board had developed a very strategic policy roadmap that would push the industry towards developing the scale and the technology that was going to be necessary to bring battery electric vehicles from something that was really very impractical, very expensive, not very convenient, and hard to use, to something that was accessible to the masses. And what I realized was it really wasn't an issue of technology. It was an issue of creating the right incentives within the policy ecosystem that would drive deployment, that would eventually allow that learning by doing to take place within the automotive sector. And so I decided at a certain point that these fourth generation biofuels weren't going to take off. They weren't coming online in the way that we had expected. And that really, due to the efforts of the California Air Resources Board, electric vehicles were going to progressively improve over the coming years and decades, and that was going to be the future. So I left Iris Engines at a certain point. I felt that we were, we were sort of hitting a wall in terms of our efforts at commercialization. I refocused my energies on electric vehicles, and I wrote a PhD dissertation on industrial policy for the automotive industry, with the focus being electrification. And at the end of that, I was hired up into the Obama administration. I was one of the only people in the country, or probably in the world at that time, really making an intensive study of the different policies that were being promoted in major automotive manufacturing and manufacturing economies and automotive markets to promote electrification. I came into the administration with a pretty comprehensive knowledge of Chinese, Japanese, and US policy on electric vehicles. And that's really how I went from someone who was interested in the environment to working on internal combustion engines to obsessed with electric vehicles. And that was 2012. I've been in the space now for well over a decade.
What were some of you said that you started like really studying the differences in the different policies between like Europe, Asia, and the US here. I know it's a lot in your book, but what would you say are the things that are played out then and are still playing out now?
So at that point, it's a little bit hard to believe now, but the Europeans were not very keen on electric vehicles. In fact, they weren't even keen on hybrid vehicles. They were saying that diesel was the best and most efficient solution, really led by the German auto manufacturers. In Asia, you had a couple of different things happening. The Chinese had started a bunch of different pilot programs to push electrification. Some of those were around the Olympics. Some of them were around the World Fair, the World Expo that was in Shanghai. These were, large-scale demonstrations with hundreds or thousands of electric vehicles. And then at a certain point, the Chinese government started pushing for broader deployment of electric vehicles. The way that they did that was quite haphazard in the early days. They basically sent a message out to the provinces and the cities and said, we want you to build electric cars, and we want the companies that are within your provinces or within your cities to build electric cars. So give them whatever subsidies or blandishments you need to get them to manufacture electric cars. And the result was you had hundreds and hundreds of companies that were building these really terrible, low quality, expensive electric vehicles. The whole system was a mess. In Japan, things were a little bit more organized. Nissan decided in the sort of late 2000s that they were going to get back into the electric vehicle game, but they were preceded by two other companies, by Mitsubishi and Subaru, that had teamed up with the Tokyo Electric Power Company to pilot a new set of technologies that were really based around the sort of current generation of lithium-ion batteries and permanent magnet motors. And they developed a fast charging ecosystem for electric vehicles that was a dramatic improvement on what had existed. Nissan followed them into that game. And quite frankly, California got back into the EV game mostly because of what was happening in Japan. There were really significant advancements being made from a technology standpoint, and there were deployments that were going on in Japan. And the Californians studied what was happening, and they realized that the pause that they had made in terms of electrification was perhaps badly timed. In the 1990s, there was a lot of pressure on car companies to build electric cars in California, and that kind of culminated in the late 1990s. The California Air Resource Board decided that they were going to refocus on hydrogen-powered vehicles rather than battery electric vehicles. And part of that was driven by the chairman of the California Air Resource Board at the time, But, I think they made a mistake. I don't think that it was something that was malicious, but right as lithium ion batteries were getting to the point where they could be practical for electric vehicles, California sort of backed away from EVs and they started investing in hydrogen vehicles and hydrogen infrastructure. But really a combination of new technology and new infrastructure was going to be needed to really get to consumer electric vehicles. And that became possible in the early 2000s, right as California backed away from electric vehicles. And they had to be reminded by Japan and later by Tesla that this stuff existed and it was actually possible.
Wow. Interesting. And you mentioned hydrogen. I just thought, this is a little aside, but in the Q3 2024, there were 99 hydrogen cars sold in the entire country, all in California, obviously, because of the infrastructure, but just 99, not too much. But on another note, because we mentioned California, I kind of want to talk to you about the push and pull factors, because we talked about this earlier. And how does California get such high EV adoption rates? And I kind of want to discuss how these push and pull factors can really affect consumers buying EVs and mass EV adoption in general.
Yeah, so look, I think that there are two things that are driving companies to build electric vehicles. And one of those things is regulation, right? So there are two kinds of regulations in the US that are driving electrification. The first is federal regulation, and the second is a set of regulations that comes out of the state of California. In the 1970s, the Clean Air Act amendments gave California some special authorities to make its own policy with respect to automotive emissions. And then they told all of the other states that they had the option to either opt into federal regulations or they could opt into California's regulations. And one of the interesting parts of this is that California's regulations had to be at least as stringent as the federal regulations. So when they made these laws, they knew that they were going to get a second set of laws that were either equally stringent or more stringent as compared to federal laws. So California has, generally speaking, been significantly more stringent than the federal government with respect to its emissions regulations. In 1990, they took kind of a quantum leap in stringency when they instituted what was called the low emission vehicle rule, which required a few things, but for our purposes, the most important of them was it required that a certain percent of the vehicles sold in the state of California had to be electric. And these aren't the exact numbers, but just, for example's sake, they said to automakers, if you sell 100 cars here, one of those cars has to be electric. And they ratcheted up that number over the course of the 90s. There was kind of a pause in the early 2000s. And then they started to ratchet it up again in the 2000s. And that's the policy roadmap that I was talking to you about. They had a clear set of regulations that were requiring automakers to sell more and more electric vehicles. Now, there are two things that the California Air Resources Board did that were really clever. The first was setting these sort of long horizons that gave automakers time to plan for these electric vehicles. But the second, and perhaps just as important element, was to, every time an automaker sold an electric vehicle, hand them a credit and create a market where these credits could be bought and sold amongst the automakers. What that meant was, if you didn't want to build electric cars, you didn't have to build an electric car, but you had to buy a credit from someone else who did build an electric car. And so that made space for companies like Tesla that were all in on electric cars to monetize the innovation that they were doing beyond the consumer. So in 2012, each Model S that sold was harvesting about $30,000 worth of ZEV credits, which is just an enormous amount of money when you're talking about a relatively low margin industry. So that really propelled Tesla's early growth. So that's what I would call the pull factor. That's the regulatory factor. In the past few years, America has gotten into the industrial policy side of the equation. And that's what I would call the push factor, which is basically subsidizing these new technologies. And we've always had some subsidies. We've had various EV purchase incentives from the federal government that really date back to the 2000s. But the IRA has doubled down on those push policies in a big way. They subsidize the extraction of rare earth elements that are required to build batteries for electric vehicles. They subsidize the construction of factories for electric vehicles and electric vehicle components, the production of battery cells, the production of battery packs, the sale of electric vehicles to consumers and also to commercial customers, the sale of used electric vehicles, and then the disposal of those vehicles in various ways, converting their batteries into energy assets that can be used in its second life, and the recycling of those batteries as well. So there's just a lot of push policy that's being applied to the EV market today. And I think one of the things that we worry about with the Trump administration and unified Republican control of Congress is that either those push policies or those pull policies or both of them will be dramatically diminished. And sometimes the changes that you get when you pull one of those pieces off the board are nonlinear, right? So you could remove the pull policies and end up with extremely large drop in EV sales, or similar situation for the push policies.
It's interesting to hear. I completely agree. It's a very delicate balance and a mix that you need to sort of provide out there to incubate this industry, especially with such high capital costs and a long time for payback, right? So there's a lot of risk there in terms of we're unsure of what Trump's going to do. But, in your book, you made the argument that China had done much of these and a lot more a lot earlier. And they are well positioned to take advantage of it now. To be a bit provocative, is it even possible for the U.S. to play catch up at this point, right? And sufficiently compete with someone who is arguably a decade ahead of us?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult, David. And the reason for that is that the Chinese have gotten farther down that cost curve than the U.S. has. Electric vehicles are a relatively commodified product. The interior might be a little bit different. Some of the interface might be a little bit different. But at the end of the day, you have four wheels, you have electric motors, you have battery cells. And the major differentiator is how fast they get you from 0 to 60. And we've learned it's not that hard to build a car that gets you from 0 to 60 faster than any normal being needs to get from 0 to 60, right? And so I think it's going to be hard. And that was part of the goal of both the Inflation Reduction Act and also set of regulatory policies, new standards from the EPA, CAFE standards, and what's called the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation from the state of California. Part of the goal there was to create a little bit of an unfair advantage for U.S. and North American-based vehicle manufacturing to try to catch up to China. Even with all those advantages, I think it would be really hard because the Chinese have reached such incredible scale. And it's going to be very difficult for America to reach that scale. And you have to reach scale if you're going to compete. Probably the only company that is close to being competitive with China is Tesla, but they're still far from competitive in terms of their cost structure.
Interesting. Now, what do you think right now? Because we have 100% tariff on Chinese cars coming into the United States. Just say these tariffs would magically disappear, and then we have an influx of Chinese cars that could enter the market. Obviously, there's many steps that would have to go through. You'd have to set up all your SIL delivery centers, all your service points, etc. But if there were no tariffs on Chinese cars, what do you think would happen to the automotive or the U.S. automotive manufacturing industry?
Yeah, and I think the biggest obstacle to importing vehicles from China is homologation. It is a huge hill to climb. And I know that's a big word that some people might not be familiar with. Basically, it means there are an enormous number of regulations. There's a book of regulations that's as thick as a phone book that you have to adhere to if you're going to sell cars in the United States of America. And that's everything from passenger safety to fire safety to where the turn signal is located to where the steering wheel is located and what kind of steering wheel is allowed. There are just so many rules that you have to adhere to if you're going to sell cars in the United States. That said, that is not an insurmountable hurdle to get over. And I think electric vehicles would become the low-cost option for mobility in the United States. I think that they would essentially eliminate or close to eliminate low-cost internal combustion engine vehicles for kind of everyday runabout transportation. There would be a lot of situations where they wouldn't be a perfect fit because people wouldn't have a place to charge their electric vehicle overnight. And that gets a little bit to the value proposition of battery swapping and Ample, which is the company where I'm currently vice president for policy. Battery swapping allows you to use an electric vehicle kind of like you use a gasoline-powered vehicle. You roll into a swapping station, they pull out your empty batteries in 5 or 10 minutes, plug in a 100% charged battery, and you're good to go. So I think technologies like that would crop up faster, actually, in the US if we had an influx of low-cost electric vehicles. But you just see a dramatic acceleration of this transition to low-carbon mobility. And in many ways, that would be a good thing. Now, at the same time, it would be, in the words of our incoming president, an absolute bloodbath in terms of industrial employment in the Midwest, in the Southeast, where you are, Andrew. You would see a massive restructuring of the automotive industry in the United States. And I think it would be chaotic and very painful for many people and many companies.
Interesting. I bet. So, but I just kind of wanted to end this conversation on one topic, which is just what is the correct approach for America to deal with China's influence in the EV space? Because it's like, for me, it's like we're kind of like just like holding a hand over our eyes, not looking, just by putting insane tariffs on Chinese cars coming into the US. But also, I 100% recognize that we need to protect our own manufacturing here because that is such a huge industry in America.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Andrew. And I can't say that I have it all figured out. I think one thing that we can't do is put up walls to Chinese EV technology and expect that somehow America is going to be globally competitive just by keeping Chinese cars out of our automotive market. That is not a solution for us. And if that's what we do, then what we're going to have is we're going to have a market that exists behind an artificial wall where we build niche vehicles that are not to the global standard in price and, quite frankly, in technology. So we need to come up with ways to make sure that we're competing at a global standard. That might involve some protections for, a number of years until we gain scale. Maybe it means buying certain technologies from the Chinese. Maybe it means collaborating with the Chinese on certain key components of electric vehicles where they have a cost advantage. At the same time, from a national security perspective, we have to make sure that we're not beholden to Chinese supply chains because there is a real geopolitical competition that is playing out between the United States and China. And what we've seen in the past on numerous occasions is that China is more than willing to use any leverage that they have over their trading partners in order to gain an advantage. They've done it with critical minerals against the Japanese. They have really created a very tense situation in the South China Sea with some of their neighbors, including the Philippines. And of course, China has had its eye on Taiwan for decades now. Xi Jinping has made it very clear that he intends to unify Taiwan with the mainland, either peacefully or by force if necessary. And there are a lot of reasons that that is not in the interest of the United States. And so we have to be careful that we're not at the mercy of China when it comes to our EV supply chains. So there are more important things than being able to buy cheap EV components. And one of those might be the defense of Taiwan.
I very much agree with you. And I'd be very interested to see how things play out in this space in the coming years. And I look forward to talking with you more to see what Trump actually does and how we can remain competitive despite the overarching Chinese threat, which completely agree. You can't delay the inevitable without doing something on our end to actually create a better product. Hopefully, on the bright side, Elon is there and involved, and he, in theory, knows how to build electric vehicles to some extent. And so hopefully he can help them make the right decisions, but who knows? It's a bit of a wild card. It's hard to predict.
Yeah, Elon is the EV OG, but I don't know, he's been a little bit inconsistent over the past few years, so I'm quite interested to see how that all shakes out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we appreciate it, Levi.
Yeah, I would just say if you're interested, check out The Great Race. It's an excellent book that, like I said earlier, just really sets the stage to what's going on now. It's definitely a good lead up to what's happening right now. So it's an excellent book. And thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Andrew. I tried to write it with a historical lens. The past is prologue, so hopefully it won't go out of style. And maybe one of these days I'll get around to writing a sequel that brings us fully up to date.
That would be pretty awesome.
I'd love that. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Well, that was a really cool conversation. Now, the thing I want to bring up while we're still on is this artificial veil he was talking about is really interesting because that kind of reminds me of the Trabant, which is the Soviet Union USSR car that was sold in East Germany. And obviously it's like they didn't really allow any imports. So everyone in East Germany was just like, let's buy the Trabant. And it was just this horrible car. And it's like, we really don't want to create, obviously the cars now on the road are not that bad, but in comparison to where Chinese automakers are, it's like, this is really interesting because you're going to have some crazy Chinese sedan that basically beats pretty much everything in the United States. That'll be like, I don't know, $15,000, $20,000. And then here you got a gas powered Toyota Camry for 30 grand. And it's like, you just can't put up an artificial barrier and expect it never to be penetrated.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's very interesting.
Yeah. No, something's going to have to change. I think we're going to have to wake up here in America that we aren't building the best cars in the world anymore. And maybe we should take something from the book over there and then make it better, right? Like progress is always about moving forward. And it's okay to sort of admit where you're falling short. So absolutely. Yeah.
Now, since we were on the topic of cars, I figured that might be a good transition into our car deal of the week, which is our way we end every episode. And the car of the week is the Mini Cooper SE. And I will share the screen right here. Okay, so this is a Mini Cooper SE. I actually used to own one. I had one for a brief period, and that was when I realized I could sell it and end up actually not losing any money on it. But that was during the crazy pandemic with car sales. But these Mini Cooper SEs, they were around like 30 to 35 brand new, but now you can get them for so low. Like here we have, maybe if we want a little bit newer one, like look at this, 2023 Mini Cooper SE. Looking at 17.9, and you don't even have to worry about the tax credit on these because they're too new for the tax credit. So basically you buy it literally 18 grand out the door for this car. And I don't know, it's a pretty cool car. It doesn't have that much range. It's about 114 miles, but 0 to 60 is in the low to mid 6-second range. And you get some nice features. Like on this model, you get a Harman Kardon sound system and a sunroof. And I don't know, it's a pretty cool car. Only 34,000 miles on this one for 18,000.
Very cool. Very cool.
Not a bad car at all.
My wife had a Cooper and she loved it. It was super fun. I think they have such a great brand. And I think it's a really interesting contrast to the Fiat that you've now also tested in person.
Yes.
And I think, they're both Europeans. I think the Cooper is a little bit bigger, but they're kind of in a similar category of like really small passenger vehicle that's supposed to be like niche, strong brand and fun. But I think this one sort of done it maybe a bit better?
I think a lot better. Well, first, I mean, this has a little bit less range and the charging capabilities aren't as good, but you're not going to be road tripping in these cars anyways. I mean, if you're going to be doing something, it's probably like a weekend trip. I mean, you're not going to go across the country in this car. The range is fine for daily driving. And I actually hypermiled mine when I had it, and I was able to get around 170 estimated miles. I didn't actually do it, but that was like literally like all city driving, no air conditioning, nothing. And that was actually pretty cool. But I got to say, the Mini Cooper is way more fun to drive than the Fiat because you have significantly more horsepower. I think it weighs less too, because the Mini Cooper SE is only around 3,100 pounds and it makes 181 horsepower. So power to weight ratio is pretty good on that car. And it is front wheel drive, but it actually handles the torque really well. It doesn't really spin the wheels that much. But yeah, I got to say, it's a fantastic car. And I think when you can get some of these for around like $15,000 to $18,000, it's a really great second car.
Yeah, I think to your criticism of Fiat, right? If you're going to charge that much money brand new, which, you could argue, I think brand new, the SC is in a very similar category.
Yes.
That like it needs to actually deliver on fun factor. And I don't think the Fiat does. And Mini, and from my experience, they do a really good job in terms of user experience research and knowing people who love Mini. I mean, there's Mini Clubs of America, right? And people just love the Mini cars specifically because they're such a fun driving experience. I'm sure there's probably a Fiat club out there, but I don't think that has the same sort of resonance with having a fun around town vehicle driving experience. Like, who could have thought it would have been fun to go get the groceries in a Mini Cooper, right? But they've built it, and in an electric vehicle, no less, which is, I think, fantastic.
Yeah, and it has like a bunch of it comes with like ambient lighting as standard. It's really cool, and there's like lots of customizability stuff. And like, I love BMW products; they're all very well built. Like, doors sound really, and the other cool things, like you get like frameless windows and stuff. Like, it feels like a very premium vehicle for not a lot of money, especially used. And I think just in this price range,
it's much more customizable. Like, just even looking on the page, there's so many different varieties that I think like there's just a lot more personality. I mean, Fiat had a couple
100%.
of interesting colors, but it wasn't quite the same as like, like look at these color schemes and these mixtures here. Like,
yeah, here you go. Got blue with yellow mirrors and white stripes and a white roof. That one's pretty cool. Here you got a enigmatic black one with
the Union Jack
British
on the
flag. Yeah, it's so cool. You get stuff like that. And yeah, I don't know, because I think that's the nice thing about Mini is they kind of position themselves as, yes, they're more affordable, but they don't really sacrifice on luxury. And it's kind of a nice upscale. I wouldn't say luxury, but it's a more upscale, nice fun car to drive.
Yeah, it's more, there's more thought to it, I think. There's just a little bit more thought in terms of bringing out the personality and connecting with the customers. So yeah,
more mature,
totally.
I think.
Yeah. But awesome. That's an amazing deal. I haven't had a chance to drive one, but I've seen them around. They do look a lot of fun. I'll see if I'll have to get a chance to sort of steal one of those sometime in the future. But yeah.
Well, if you're selling your R1T for the R1S, maybe you need a small city car to have the second one.
Maybe, you just need a little around town car. Everyone needs one of those. So maybe. But yeah, no, it was really fun this week. Love the car, love the discussion. Yeah, I could talk all day about it. I'm interested to see how Levi's book and his predictions sort of pan out with this new Trump administration, for sure.
Yes, I think it's very interesting in just seeing that there will probably be a lot of radical change. And there was actually an article this week on Inside EVs talking that it is kind of in the plans that the $7,500 EV tax credit could be somehow, or they don't like it at least. And obviously you have to get House of Representatives and Senate support. But yeah, we don't know what's going to happen. And that's kind of a little scary because there could be a lot of change. But I think just the overarching thing that we have to realize is these EV credits do help getting people into electric cars, and especially how we have it set up now, where it prioritizes U.S. and North American manufacturers, is a huge deal. So I think that is a big thing, that by incentivizing companies to have their facilities here in the US, creating US jobs is so big. And if we just ignore it, it's like we can't just hold a blind eye to probably the biggest transformation in the technological and automotive sector ever. So we have to pay attention and make sure we're doing a right approach, because we can't just view this as some culture wars thing. Oh, EVs suck, they're blah, blah, blah. That's not going to work. And we will see a collapse of the automotive industry.
Yep, 100%. Hopefully it doesn't happen though.
I hope it doesn't either. I think that
yeah.
wraps up our episode for today. So it was nice having Levi on and talking about some EV deals. So, yep. Thanks again for watching.